Good morning, students, and a warm welcome to you this morning. I'm Ms. Isabel Besaidenout, and we're going to look at the learner support in English today for the degree, the Bachelor in Education for Secondary Education. This is a contact-based session which specifically is going to focus on the most important work, keeping in mind the coming examinations for 2018. So without further ado, let's first have a look at a short introduction about what this module is about. It's a module that is studied in Year 4 in Semester 1, and it aims to teach you to analyze learning support of issues regarding the teaching, learning of grammar, speaking, reading, writing, prose, poetry, as well as assessment. So the main aims of the module is to enable the student to develop the theoretical understanding, values and competencies regarding the support of upper primary learners in English. We move on to Unit 1, which is titled The Key Issues Underpinning Learner Support and Syllabus Guidelines. And first of all, I want to look at some challenging behavior that the teacher may encounter in the classroom. Now, learners who are raised in poverty really choose to behave differently, but they are faced daily with overwhelming challenges. And the significant risk factors that we identify which may affect these learners are emotional and social challenges, acute and chronic stresses, cognitive lags, as well as health and safety issues. The types of behavior that manifest then are likely to be acting out behaviors, impatience and impulsivity, gaps in politeness and social graces, as well as a more limited range of behavioral responses, inappropriate emotional responses, and less empathy for others' misfortunes. Now we should ask ourselves, how do we respond to this challenging behavior in the classroom? Every proper response that you do not see at your school is one that you need to be teaching. Rather than telling learners to be respectful, demonstrate appropriate emotional responses and the circumstances in which to use them, and then allow the learners to practice and apply them. To shift your own responses to inappropriate behavior, you should reframe your thinking to expect the learners to be impulsive and to blurt inappropriate language and to act disrespectful until you have taught them stronger social and emotional skills and until the social conditions at your school make it attractive not to do those things. We are next going to move on to a topic which has a look at the difference between maintenance rehearsal and elaborative rehearsals as strategies that can be used to increase memory. We start off with maintenance rehearsal, which consists of using some memory strategies that keeps or maintains information in the short-term memory, but it does little to facilitate the transfer of the information from the short-term memory to the long-term memory. An example, for instance, is when you repeat a telephone number over and over again until you dial it. And then if we compare it to elaborate rehearsal, we see that elaborative rehearsal is then a more active process, which involves elaborating on the new incoming information in some way. Thus, it may consist of making associations between the new information and what one already knows, creating a mental image of the new information, recoding it in some way, or creating a mnemonic device that helps the memory of the information. So one can see that when you practice elaborate rehearsal, there's a more active process and more of an understanding that is going on. Furthermore, elaborative rehearsal is more effective both for transferring information from short-term memory to long-term memory and for storing information in the long-term memory. Many learners unknowingly use maintenance rehearsal strategies as their primary strategies for learning. For example, when they learn vocabulary words, they'll write the words on one side of an index card and then the definition on the other side, and then they start repeating it over and over again. While the act of writing the words and the definitions on the index cards is not in itself useless, study should consist of more than just reading the two over and over. Learners have to still engage in some sort of elaborative rehearsal strategy in order, for instance, to really understand what the vocabulary words mean. When we think about our thinking processes and learning, then the cognitive domain is a very important aspect that we need to look at. Now, this domain involves knowledge and the development of intellectual skills. It includes the following: recall or recognition of specific facts, procedural patterns and concepts that serves in the development of intellectual abilities and skills. And there are 6 specific categories of cognitive processes that we are going to concentrate on, and they start from the simplest to the most complex. The first process is to remember or to know. This includes recognizing or recalling knowledge from memory. Remembering is when memory is used to produce or retrieve definitions, facts or lists, or to recite previously learned information. The second is understanding. Understanding includes constructing meaning from different types of functions, like written or graphic messages, or activities like interpreting, exemplifying, classifying, summarizing, inferring, comparing, or explaining. Then we move on to something more difficult, which is applying. Applying is to carry out or use a procedure through executing or implementing. It relates to or refers to situations where learned material is used through products like models, presentations, interviews, or simulations. Then we go over to analyzing. Now, when you analyze, you break up materials or concepts into parts, and you study how these parts relate to one another, or how they interrelate, or how the parts may relate to an overall structure or purpose. And the mental actions that are involved here are differentiating, organizing, attributing, as well as distinguishing. In the 5th place, we have evaluating. When we evaluate, we are expected to make a judgment which is based on criteria and standards through checking and critiquing. And examples are critiques, recommendations, and reports that demonstrate evaluation. The last and the highest function is being able to create. Creating means putting elements together to form a coherent or functional whole, reorganizing elements into a new pattern through generating, planning, or producing. It requires learners to put parts together in a new way, or to synthesize parts into something new and different, thus creating a new form or product. And this, as we said, is the most difficult mental function. This brings us to Unit 2, titled Elements of Learning Support for the Upper Primary Curriculum of English. And the first important aspect I want to emphasize here is the difference between integrated and segregated skill instruction in the English classroom. When we look at what segregated instruction is, we see that it's a mastery of discrete language skills such as reading and speaking, which is seen as the key to successful learning. And language learning in this case is typically separate from content learning. When we have a segregated skill of English second language classes, it is presented in terms of skills that are linked with learned strategies. For example, reading strategies, listening strategies, speaking strategies, and writing strategies. The extreme example of segregated instruction is the grammar translation method, where learners are taught to analyze grammar and to translate, usually in writing, from one language to another. It's a method that restricts language learning to a very narrow, non-communicative range, and it does not prepare learners to use the language in everyday life. As opposed to the segregated instruction method, we get the integrated instruction method. Now here people are encouraged, or they use their language skills in normal communication, and it actually clashes with the direction in which language teaching experts have been moving in recent years. It exposes English language learners to authentic language and challenges them to interact naturally in the language. In this type of instruction, learners rapidly gain a true picture of the richness and the complexity of the English language as employed for communication. Moreover, this approach stresses that English is not just an object of academic interest, nor merely a key to passing an examination. Instead, English now becomes a real means of interaction and sharing among people. The approach allows teachers to track learners' progress in multiple skills at the same time. Integrating the language skills also promotes the learning of real content, not just the dissection of language forms. Last but not least, the integrated skill approach, whether found in content-based or task-based language instruction or some hybrid form, can be highly motivating to learners of all ages and backgrounds. A second very important aspect that I would like you to concentrate on is the overview of a number of teaching methods that we as English second language teachers should take note of. And I would like you to take note of the focus and the characteristics of each method. And this is all still part of Unit 2. Now, I'm just going to briefly go through each method's focus and characteristics. The grammar translation focus on written literary text, and one of the characteristics is to translate from English into your native language. We get the direct method, where everyday spoken language is the focus, and learners learn by associating meaning directly in English. In the third place, the audiolingual method focuses on sentences and sound patterns, and learners are expected to listen and speak drills and pattern practice only in English. In the fourth place, we have the cognitive code approach, which focuses on grammar rules, and English grammar rules are deduced and then understood in context. We also have the silent way, where learner interaction rather than teacher interaction is the focus. Here, the teacher is silent to allow the learner awareness of how English works. Then we have a method called Suggestopedia, which focuses on meaningful text and vocabulary. It is important here that there is a relaxed atmosphere with music, and it encourages subliminal learning of English. Lastly, we have the community language learning approach, which focuses on learner interaction, and it is characterized by understanding of English through active learner interaction. We also have the comprehension approach, which focuses on listening comprehension and is characterized by English speaking that is delayed until the learners are ready, meaning clarified through actions and visuals. The communicative language teaching, which I think all of us are quite familiar with, focuses on interaction, authentic communication, and negotiating meaning. And here the focus should be on the understanding of English through active learner interaction, role play, games, as well as information gaps. So that was quite a mouthful, but please take note of these and be able to understand what the main focus of each is, what their characteristics are, and what might the possible advantages and disadvantages of each of those methods be. Next, let's have a look have a look at a topic of a totally different nature, but something which is very important in all teaching. And it involves teaching of values in each and every subject. Teaching is not just about teaching a subject, but also about teaching learners' values. It's especially true when you teach languages, as you need to raise awareness about cultural differences. Our role as teachers is to convey values, whatever our subjects are, simply because we are human beings and we work with and influence human beings. Our classroom is a community, and we teach learners from various backgrounds with different needs and aspirations. This is what makes teaching unique as a profession, and we should be in charge of teaching and modeling appropriate values to our learners. In socially, culturally, and economically deprived areas, teaching these values can be an everyday battle though. Then you should ask yourself the following questions. How can I instill these values on teenagers that are responsible for their disabled parents, for instance? You might have to ask yourself, how can I explain to the bully the importance of respect? Or perhaps, how can I insist on children's rights when some children are abused? The first aspect is about the moral and ethical values that are conveyed in a subject. For example, if you teach languages, the questions of respect, empathy, and tolerance are naturally embedded in the curriculum. Respect, care, and empathy are universal values, and they have to be taught inside and outside the classroom. All teaching should be based on these values, no matter what the subject. As teachers, we tend to naturally promote these values when we encourage and promote communication in the classroom. When learners are given the opportunity to express themselves and to give their opinions on different topics, we teach them the values of respect, as they need to listen to each other as well. Why do we teach values specifically in the classroom, or how can it assist our learners? It helps our learners to develop, firstly, a love of learning, to pursue excellence and high standards, to develop care and respect for themselves and others, to take pride in their work, to exhibit a strong sense of fairness and social justice, to respect and understand Namibia's history, including the cultures and the experiences of the different ethnic groups, as well as to actively participate as citizens. That brings us to Unit 3. Now here we are very specifically going to focus on learning support for issues about the teaching learning of grammar. And in this module, it will be expected of you to write out a comprehensive lesson preparation. In this case, I was focusing on a grade 7 lesson, but it doesn't necessarily have to be grade 7. You may usually, in an examination, choose a suitable topic for any English lesson, or in some cases, I will give you a topic to address. In order to answer this question effectively, you should have a look at the content in your study guide, as well as know your English second language syllabus. You should then use the lesson plan that I provide you. It will be similar to the one that you find in your study guide. I would like to refer you there to Unit 7, specifically point 7.6.1, which gives you example of lesson plans on writing short stories. And then if you refer to Unit 8, 8.6.4, there's a good example of a lesson plan in poetry. I also want to focus on some of the indirect methods of instruction in this unit. The first indirect method is problem solving. There are two major types of problem solving: reflective and creative. Regardless of the type of problem solving a class uses, problem solving focuses on knowing the issues, considering all the possible factors, and finding a solution. Because all ideas are accepted initially, problem solving allows for finding the best possible solution, as opposed to the easiest solution or the first solution proposed. Another method is learner self-evaluation. Self-evaluation of learner responses occurs during indirect instruction when you give learners the opportunity to reason out their answers, so you and the other learners can suggest needed changes. Learners can most easily conduct self-evaluation in the context of learner to teacher exchanges, wherein you encourage them to comment and to consider the accuracy of their own and each other's responses. What then, we might ask, is the difference between direct and indirect instruction? According to Borich, direct instruction strategies are best suited for the teaching of facts, rules, and action consequences. In other words, when we want learners to come away from a lesson with a strict factual knowledge, a direct instruction, presentation, or lecture format is best suited for the job. Learners benefit from direct instruction when the objective is the attainment of content knowledge and facts, as this instruction provides for teacher-to-learner instruction, usually in the form of a lecture-based presentation. On the other hand, indirect instruction is better suited for concept learning, inquiry learning, and problem-centered learning. It sets up a learner-to-learner learning process with the teacher acting more as the guide or the moderator. It helps the learner to learn higher-order thinking skills and gives them a chance to link their content knowledge with real-world examples. An inquiry and discussion-based strategy, indirect instruction allows for learners to build their own concepts and establish patterns. It contrasts with direct instruction in the way that it is mainly learner-centered, although it's important to note that the two strategies can complement each other. It seeks a high level of learner involvement in the sense that learners are expected to observe, investigate, draw inferences from data, or form hypotheses. We also see that this kind of instruction takes advantage of learners' interest and curiosity, often encouraging them to generate alternatives or to solve problems. The role of the teacher shifts from being merely a lecturer to that of a facilitator, a supporter, and a resource person. The teacher is the one who arranges the learning environment and provides an opportunity for learner involvement, and when appropriate, provides feedback to the learners while they conduct the inquiry. Some examples of indirect instruction include problem solving, as we mentioned in the first place, reading for meaning, the use of questions to guide search and discovery, learner experience and use of learning ideas, learner self-evaluation, as well as the use of group discussions. Let's now have a look at grammar games and their importance in the English second language classroom. Some guidelines to why we should use grammar games are the following. Games can shake things up a bit in the class and help learners to develop a competitive streak. It may encourage cooperative learning and get learners' pent-up energy out. It also helps learners to keep things fresh. Younger learners need a purpose to study, which games might provide. And lastly, games target young learners' learning potential. Now, the two grammar games that we're going to specifically focus on is the role play and simulations as forms of experiential learning. Some examples of the types of role play that we get is the conflict role play, cooperative role play, information gap role, as well as task-based role play, and I would expect you to at least be able to define each of these in one simple sentence to show your understanding. Now, if you want to employ role play in your classroom, what are the kind of questions you should ask yourself when designing it? First of all, you might ask, what kinds of language structures or grammar points do I want learners to use? And will this role play incorporate them naturally? Do I know in my own mind what I want to see to occur in the role play? Do the learners have the language and social skills to manage the specific situation? Can I issue set-up instructions clearly and make sure that all participants understand their own roles? Is the situation appropriate for the age level and status of the learners in the group? And of course, what do I want the learners to take away from the exercise? And how can I reinforce this through feedback? So as you can see, one cannot simply stumble into selecting a role play. There are careful considerations to make as well. Let's have a look at role play and simulation specifically in grammar lessons. As we said, it's an example of experiential learning. Learners are expected to take on different roles, assuming a profile of a character or a personality, and then interact and participate in diverse and complex learning settings. Role plays and simulation function as learning tools for teams and groups or individual as they play face-to-face. They can alter the power ratios in teaching and learning relationships between learners and educators. Why? Because learners learn through their explorations and the viewpoints of the character or personality they're articulating in the environment that you've created. This learner-centered space can enable learner-oriented assessment where the design of the task is created for active learning. Learners are actively involved in both self and peer assessment and obtain sustainable formative feedback. There's widespread evidence that educators and learners experience satisfaction with assessment as learning through role play, games, and simulation. Simulated learning environments, or SLEs as they are called, provide a safe, supportive environment where learners can develop their clinical skills, their competency, and agencies. SLC are also flexible and controllable, and educators find they can design suitable as well as varied education events within them. Furthermore, in terms of English second language teaching role plays, it gives learners the opportunities to demonstrate how they should use English in real life situations, as well as make them focus more on communicating than just on the grammar aspects. Role play activities can be a great deal of fun, and that's why it is ideal for the final lesson on a particular topic. If learners perform well, you can move on to the next chapter, whereas if learners struggle, you might address some of the mistakes in the following lesson. The feedback that we give in any role play situation should primarily be positive and focus on pronunciation, acting, and creativity. Lastly, role plays are about encouraging your learners and building their self-confidence. This brings us to Unit 4, which focuses on learning support for listening and speaking. And our first aspect for this unit is the 2 ways that we can help our students to focus their attention during a listening activity. It's valuable to give a simple listening task, for example, a table of information for students to complete while they are listening. You might give 1 or 2 guiding questions before the listening so that students can listen then and find the answers. To help them even more, introduce the topic beforehand so that they are able to predict what they might hear. Divide the listening into stages. For instance, firstly, listening for main ideas. Then, when students listen again, let them start listening for details. If it's a very long listening text, rather divide it into sections and check their comprehension after each section. It's also very valuable to use a cassette recorder for intensive listening. You should then go about as follows. Play the whole text and check the general comprehension. Play part of the text again, pausing after particular remarks to see if the students could catch what was said. And then if it's necessary, you might rewind the cassette a little way and then play the remark again. For the listening exercises, I also want you to consider what are the different types of questions that you may incorporate in a listening lesson for English second language learners. Our next topic, which links with listening exercises. What are the strategies that the teacher can use to understand the emotions of a speaker? Now, these are strategies that we also teach our learners in order to understand messages better. First of all, it is advised to stop. This means focus on the other person, their thoughts and feelings, and focusing on quieting your own internal commentary. Secondly, teach them to look. That means pay attention to non-verbal messages without letting yourself be distracted. In the third place, listen. Listen for the essence of the speaker's thoughts, the details, the major ideas, and their meanings. That will enable you to seek an overall understanding of what the speaker is trying to communicate. In the fourth place, it's important to be empathetic. Imagine how you would feel in their circumstances. Then also ask questions. Use questions to clarify your understanding and to demonstrate your interest in what is being said. Also, try to analyze your own perceptions. That means question your perceptions and think about how they are formed. Then, work on improving your perception, meaning increase your awareness of barriers to perception and which ones you tend towards. Then, of course, focus on others. Develop your ability to focus on other people and to understand them better by trying to gather knowledge about them, listen to them actively, and imagining how you would feel in their situation. We move over to Unit 5, and this now concentrates on how to support learners in reading specifically. One of the approaches that I would like to highlight here is the language experience approach to teaching learners to read. And let's have a look and see how this works. This particular method actually uses the learner's own words to help them read. The learner might draw a picture of his dad in a car. In that case, you will write under the drawing, "Dad is in the car." And you will continue to collect several drawings that the learner has made and then writing a sentence under each of these drawings. For instance, if there's a picture of a playground, you might write, "We went to the park or playground." Picture of the cat sat on the mat, and so forth. When you've collected enough pictures, you compile a little booklet for the learner, which he or she can read again and again. Write underneath the drawing a description your learner gives for the drawing. Then the learner will remember it much better than if you just write what you want to write. First, you will write every word and sentence. Slowly your learner will begin to trace over the words you have written, and finally the learner will write the words and sentences all alone. Sometimes this method is used as a first approach to reading in order to help the learner understand that what they have drawn and what you have written is a form of communication between you and the learner. The approach supports learners' concept development and vocabulary growth while offering them many opportunities for meaningful reading as well as writing activities through the use of personal experiences and oral language. A next method that's also used very widely is the phonic approach to teaching English to learners. It's probably best known and widely used to teach learners reading and writing, and it relies on the learners being taught the alphabet first. So that would mean learners would first learn the names of the letters and then learn the sounds they make. Once they know the letter sounds, they start to blend two letters together to make simple words. Then they take 3 letters, then 4, and so forth. To learn the phonics method, learners need phonically written books using regular words that are interesting to them. Each word has to be sounded out by the learner in order to achieve the highest level outcome. So they will, for example, say the at on the mat. So they will sound each word in order to read. Learning the sounds and their blends might be uninteresting though for young learners, so the teacher should really try to keep it short and entertaining. It can also be that often the learner is so busy concentrating on the sounding and the blending that they don't really learn the meaning of the word, which of course might make it even more boring. That's why you should ensure that you explain the meaning or expound on the words to keep the learner's interest and enthusiasm. It's suggested that you introduce 1 letter a day or week, but the 1 letter a day method generally works quite well and it doesn't become boring. If you take 1 letter a week, it tends to drag out the process a bit, and then the learner may often lose the plot halfway through. If that happens, you might have a sense of failure and you'll also become bogged down. On the other hand, you shouldn't be disheartened if 2 or 3 days or even a week is needed to master one letter. Learners will improve, and before long, you'll find there's no stopping their young brains. Children are natural learners and are more than willing to please you, thus doing well in their learning experience. It's found that with the phonics method, most children are able to read the basic words and sentences within 3 to 6 months. Another aspect of reading and speaking is stammering, and this can be very, very difficult to approach when you have a learner in your class that stammers. So I think it's useful. Let us look at a few guidelines on how to help these learners. First of all, it's very important that there's a relaxed atmosphere or environment, whether it's at home or in the classroom, and that the learner is allowed many opportunities to speak. It includes making time for them to talk to one another, especially when the learner is excited and has a lot to say. It's very important that we never react negatively when a learner stammers. If you give any corrections, that should be done in a gentle way. And also concentrate on giving praise when the learner speaks without a stammer. Speak in a slightly slow and a relaxed way to encourage a positive atmosphere, and listen very carefully when the learner speaks, waiting for them to say the intended word. Try very hard not to complete the learner's sentences for them, so that requires patience. Help learners to be confident that they can communicate successfully even when they struggle with a stammer. You should also provide consistent feedback to the learner about their speech in a friendly, non-judgmental and supportive way. Talk to them openly about the stammering if they want to talk about it, and in addition, provide them with some exercises, especially if you want to treat the physiological causes of the stammering. It has been found that generally exercises that provide strength to the organs associated with speech, including the tongue, lips, jaw, trachea, and lungs, are very effective in helping learners with their stammering. It's beneficial in the way that it reduces the intensity, and in some cases it can even completely cure the stammering. The exercises should preferably be done every night in a secluded area before the learner goes to bed. This brings us to our 6th unit, which involves learning support for writing. And here I decided that I would like to concentrate on using educational technologies in writing lessons. And first of all, I want to look at using film and video, and let's have a look at why this is useful. If you can use short feature-length videos, it can be an engaging way to work on skills like vocabulary and comprehension. It helps to expose the learners to the use of natural English. And we know that our young learners especially enjoy short cartoons and animated movies, while our older learners might learn about current events through news broadcasts. There's a very useful site that you can use called ESL Partyland, which has a lot of free resources, which include vocabulary worksheets, discussion questions to accompany films like Bonnie and Clyde, Vertigo, as well as Dead Man Walking. This site also offers a film survey to assess learners' interests before you can choose your films, as well as film reviews that can be adapted for any level of instruction. Another useful technological device is the apps that we have, and we know in this age or day and age, most learners have devices or smartphones that they might download these apps on, and this can really help them to learn English and make it less frustrating and difficult. The apps on the iPads and the tablets are great ways for them to practice their English as well as have fun doing it. For instance, if you want to practice grammar rules, you get an app called Grammar App that will allow your learners to test their knowledge on specific topics. It also keeps track of their progress and allows them to skip questions by shaking the tablet. Then there's a site, Best Colleges Online, that gives you a list of 16 apps that are useful for English second language learners, ranging from basic letter instruction to a pronunciation guide. Learners can also play classic games like Scrabble and Boggle on mobile devices to learn and improve their English skills. Then there's another interesting aspect that we can have a look at, and that is blogging. Blogging can be very useful to enhance English second language instruction. If you have a class blog, it could provide a forum for your learners to practice their writing skills. There's LiveJournal, EduBlog, and Blogger, which can allow you to create blogs for free. Learners find the blogging appealing because it's a more authentic writing experience, and the wider audience typically has access to read posted entries, which means the learners tend to put in more effort when they write these blogs. Teachers can get their learners to write about specific topics that they find interesting, or the learners can provide commentary on current events and social justice issues. The more they practice their writing skills, the more proficient, of course, they will become. So it is recommended that you encourage your learners to do a weekly or even a daily blog. Blogs also provide good opportunities for family members to see what their learners are working on in class. Another aspect which forms part of this unit is the specific writing problems that learners in your class may be challenged with. Now, this once again is a short overview of what these are about. So let's quickly go through them, and you make sure that you fully understand what is implied by each of these. First of all, learners might have a problem with incorrect grammar and spelling, poor vocabulary, and poor sentence structure. What might be a possible solution in short? Consult the teacher, the other teachers, and discuss the observation and concerns. And also ask yourself in this case, might there be other learning problems that this learner is challenged with? The next problem involves poorly structured essays and unsupported ideas. Here some valuable solutions might be to aim to give positive feedback to the learner, to incorporate writing into family activities, and importantly, not to rush the learner's writing. Then we also get students, when they try to write, they feel very frustrated, or maybe they procrastinate. What can we do in this case? Try to suggest or find them extra help, possibly to consult with appropriate professionals in this regard. We now go over to learner support for prose, which is in Unit 7. And I think first of all, we need to have a look at what our aims are when we teach learners prose. Teaching prose to learners will enable them the following. That means, if it's done effectively, of course, to understand a passage and grasp its meaning, to read with correct pronunciation, stress, intonation, pause, and articulation of voice, to enable learners to understand passages by silent reading and enrich their active and passive vocabulary, to express the ideas of the passage orally and in writing, to enjoy the reading and writing they do, and of course also to develop their imagination. Why is it important to not only include prose, but also literature and short stories in your English? So in other words, why is it important that we concentrate on prose and short stories in our English classes? Prose is a form of language which applies ordinary grammatical structure and natural flow of speech rather than rhythmic structure. While there are critical debates on the construction of prose, its simplicity and loosely defined structure has led to its adoption for the majority of spoken dialogue, factual discourse, as well as topical and fictional writing. Commonly used, for example, in literature, newspaper, magazines, encyclopedias, broadcasting, film, history, philosophy, law, and many other forms of communication. Now, what are the specific benefits of prose? Firstly, we see that it could broaden the reader's horizon and view of the world concerning foreign cultures and different people. It also introduces readers to a world of mystery and wonders. It might offer them with creative texts which require personal exploration and therefore motivates them to read to find out more. It also offers them the opportunity to use their creativity and develop their critical thinking skills. It encourages interactions between them as well. Since prose often contains multiple layers of meaning, it can effectively be used for class discussions, sharing different learners' opinions and feelings. It may help learners to explore underlying meanings and develop their understanding of their own position as well as that of others. Short stories in particular make the learner's reading task easier because of its short and simple nature in comparison to other forms of writing. Then, since prose is written in chapters and paragraphs, learners also gain an understanding of the structural and organizational elements of a story. What is a good strategy to teach your learners how to write prose? Here I want to focus on the 5S strategy, and it works as follows. After you've given your learners a prose passage, offer them a graphic organizer with the following headings: speaker, situation, sentences, shifts, and syntax. Walk them through the process of recording their observations and interpretations under each of these headings of the graphic organizer, using the evidence that they get from the prose for support. For example, in the syntax section, learners could record examples from the reading in which the word order seemed interesting or significant. After the example then, urge the learners to comment on how the syntax affected the overall meaning of the passage. Then we can also have a look at the problem and solution organizational structure in writing prose. This requires the writer to state a problem and come up with a solution. So as you can see, we are now not focusing on analyzing what we have read, we are now aiming at writing our own piece of prose. Although the problem-solution structures are typically found in informational writing, realistic fiction also often uses a problem-solution structure that learners can learn to identify. Any one of us who have watched a great movie for 90 minutes only to have it limp to the finish with a weak ending, know that strong endings are just as critical to effective writings as strong beginnings. Furthermore, anyone who has watched the director's cut of a movie with all the alternative endings will know that even great directors have trouble coming up with satisfying endings for their movies. So then, like a director, the writer has to come up with a way to wrap up the action in stories, to resolve the conflict, and to tie up loose ends in a way that will leave the audience satisfied. Learner writers struggle with writing strong endings because they often rely on the weak, I had a lot of fun, or the classic, it was just a dream ending, to rescue them from their stories. The type of ending that the author chooses depends on what the purpose is. When the purpose is to entertain, endings may be happy or tragic, or a surprise ending may provide a twist. Endings can also be circular, meaning they loop back to the beginning, so the readers end where they began, or they might leave the reader hanging, wishing for more. Endings can be deliberately ambiguous or ironic, designed to make the reader think, or they can explicitly state the moral of the story, telling the readers what to think. This brings us to our very last unit, Unit 8, which deals with, I'm lying to you, this is our second last unit. Unit 8, learning support in issues about poetry. Now, firstly, let us have a look at the reasons why we should teach our learners poetry. What is the value? It helps us know each other and build community. Secondly, it can allow learners to paint sketches of their lives using metaphor, imagery, and symbolic language to describe painful experiences or parts of themselves that they are not ready to share. When read aloud, poetry is rhythm and music and sounds and beats. Young learners, and that includes babies and preschoolers, may not understand all the words or the meaning, but they can feel the rhythm, and that makes them curious about what the sounds mean and perhaps encourages them to want to create their own. Poetry often opens venues for speaking and listening, much neglected domains of a robust English language arts curriculum. Furthermore, poetry has space for English language learners. Why? Because poems defy rules, poetry can be made accessible. Poems can be easily scaffolded, and learners can find ways of expressing their voices while being limited in their vocabulary. It also builds resilience in learners and adults and fosters social and emotional learning. Secondly, it's then important, it links with why we should teach poetry. We then have to look at the aims of upper primary poetry. The first important aim is critical analysis. Poems use a variety of techniques, metaphor, imagery, rhyme and meter, to convey meaning. Picking out these techniques and thinking about how they function in the poem help learners to develop their analytic and critical skills. Poems can also have multiple layers of meaning that readers must analyze carefully to understand. Secondly, another aim would be creativity and enthusiasm. Learners can become very enthusiastic about poetry in the classroom, connecting their reading experiences to their experiences of music and their own lives. Moreover, allowing learners to write poetry for class encourages them to express themselves creatively. Although some learners may not be motivated by writing academic papers, poetry allows them to play freely with words, rhythms and ideas. An example of this is Lewis Carroll's poems The Jabberwocky, which uses made-up words, for instance mimsy, borogoves and so forth, to play creatively with rhythm, sound and language. Now we have reached the last unit of this module, which focuses on learning support in the assessment of English. And I would like us to consider a very important statement here, which is assessment is needed for effective teaching. And I want to encourage you to think about this statement before you even go and read what it says in this unit. First of all, there are two important conclusions about teachers who stand out. Firstly is, how do they prepare to teach? They begin with questions about learners' learning objectives rather than about what the teacher will do. Then, how do they check their progress and evaluate their efforts? They usually have a systematic program to assess their own efforts and to make appropriate changes if need be. They assess their learners based on the primary learning objectives rather than on arbitrary standards. People tend to learn most effectively when they are trying to solve problems, and these might be different kinds of problems: intellectual, physical, artistical, practical, as well as abstract problems. Or they also learn when they create something new that they find intriguing, beautiful, and or important. They are able to do so in a challenging yet supportive environment in which they can feel a sense of control over their own education. They should be able to work collaboratively with others to grapple with these problems, and you should enable them or encourage them to believe that their work will be considered fairly and honestly, and that they have the freedom to try and fail, and they'll receive feedback from expert learners in advance of, as well as separate from, any summative judgment of their efforts. What is the characteristics of the quality learning environment in which this effective learning and assessment should take place? First of all, we want our environment to be learner-centered as opposed to teacher-centered. That means paying careful attention to the knowledge, skills, attitudes and belief that learners bring to the educational setting. It should also be knowledge-centered, taking seriously the need to help learners become knowledgeable by learning in ways that lead to understanding. But then, being assessment-centered is also important. There should be opportunities for feedback and revision, and what is assessed is congruent with the learner's learning goals. Formative assessment should involve the use of assessments as sources of feedback to improve teaching as well as learning. Summative assessment measures what the learners have learned at the end of some set of learning activities. Then in the last place, it's very important that it's community-centered. What does this imply? Referring to several aspects of community including the classroom as community, the school as community, and the degree to which learners, teachers, and administrators feel connected to the larger community of homes, business, states, the nation, and even the world. So that is a mouthful to consider. Now that brings me to the end of the presentation, to the last important aspect I want to emphasize. When you start studying for this module, please make sure that you really understand what you are learning. It's very difficult for any person to memorize and to reproduce facts that they don't really understand. So I want to encourage you to use your dictionary if you need to. When you're in the examination situation, read your questions very carefully so that you can determine what you should include in your answer, and also importantly, how are you supposed to approach the question that has been posed to you. When you are asked to discuss, to examine, to evaluate, write full grammatically correct sentences. Please do not answer in bullet points if any type of discussion is expected of you. Now, the level 2 and 3 questions that we refer to are those ones where your own input in addition to stating the facts is required, and they will be characterized by action words such as analyze, examine, evaluate, critically discuss, investigate, all those. And then you should know, I have to give an opinion or a judgment, and I have to draw a conclusion. Thus, it implies you make a certain judgment and you give your own opinion based on what you've discussed. So that brings us to action verbs that are used in question. These verbs give you a clue of the thinking processes that are important in your answer. You can go and have a look in section 7 in the beginning of the study guide. There you'll find the table of verbs, and they'll explain to you what each of them entail. And it's very important, not just in examinations and also not just in this subject, but in every module that you do at IOL, in every assignment, in every exam, that you know what these action verbs mean and that you approach answering in the correct way. Students, that is the end of today's session. I just want to repeat my contact details. As I said, I'm Ms. Poseidon-Out. I want to encourage you, please contact me if you struggle with any aspect of the module. You are very welcome to send me an SMS. Please, just with the module that you are enrolled in, and then I will phone you back at an appropriate time. If you have an email address, it's also very useful to send me an email, and then I can answer you in a comprehensive manner, and we can assist one another in helping you to get ready for the exam and to complete this module in the most effective way possible. Thank you very much for your time today, and I wish you all the best of luck. Goodbye, students.